am super excited today to be talking to you about Bertrand Russell. I think he's one of my favourite historical philosophers of all time. He was a super technical philosopher who contributed original ideas to mathematics and logic and technical philosophy. He was also a public intellectual, a public writer, and I think a pretty decent human being. So let's dive right in. We're going to start looking at some of the ideas that he came up with and his influence on philosophy as a whole. So let's start with perhaps Russell's biggest contribution to philosophy. He was one of the founders of the Analytic school of philosophy. What's that? So Analytic philosophy, I guess it means different things to different people, but it's basically a style of philosophy. It's a general methodology or a way of approaching philosophy. It's not a particular viewpoint in an area of philosophy. It's a way of doing philosophy and a way of approaching questions that basically says we aim for clarity, for clear argument, and we try and get to the truth of the matter by getting as clear as we can on what the problem is and then using logical tools and other reasoning tools to help us unpick problems in language. Some people align it with using the tools of science to try and get to the truth. It's not really saying that we should use just scientific method, but it's definitely about using logic and clear and rational thinking to try and get to the truth of deep philosophical questions. So it's a school of philosophy that began around 1900. It was founded by pretty much Bertrand Russell and G. Moore, very much influenced by the German logician Gottlob Frege, and it's still going today. Many philosophers, perhaps most philosophers who work in the Anglophone world, in the UK, in the US, in Scandinavia, in Australia and New Zealand, writing in English more or less, identify in some way as analytic philosophers. So as well as Russell and Moore and Frege, you might think of the key historical analytic philosophers being Ludwig Wittgenstein, perhaps Frank Ramsey, Quine, the great American philosopher, and Rudolf Carnap and the other members of the Vienna Circle. The rejection of idealism. So part of setting up this new way of doing philosophy, analytic philosophy, comes through Russell and Moore's rejection of idealism. So what's going on there? Idealism, and in particular Hegelian or absolute idealism, this is like the big kind of philosophical view around at the time when Russell was a student, so end part of the 19th century. Hegel had been one of the most dominant philosophers of the 19th century, and his influence was huge in Germany, but also in the UK. British idealism kind of followed on from Hegelian idealism. It was the dominant form of thought in British academia at the time. People like F.H. Bradley were the leading philosophers. They were pretty much absolute idealists in the mould of Hegel. And Russell and Moore, in different ways, they both came to reject this style of thought. Moore was talking about ethics, but he was a realist about ethics. He thought that there were moral facts out there in the world, independently of us, that we can know. And Russell, kind of similarly, he was thinking about realism in metaphysics. He thought the physical world was out there independently of our minds. So in different ways, Moore and Russell came to reject idealism, and this was a really important stage in the development of British and worldwide analytic philosophy. Logic and mathematics. In the early part of his career, most of Russell's important developments were in logic and mathematics and the philosophy of logic and mathematics. So along with Frege, Russell was one of the key developers of modern mathematical logic, the kind of logic that we learn, first year in a philosophy or maths or computer science degree. And as well as making these key technical advances in mathematics and logic, he developed philosophical takes on logic and maths. So he was a logicist, okay? So the idea that mathematics ultimately reduces to formal logic and ultimately can be given as an axiomatic system. And this was important for epistemological reasons. So how do we know mathematical truths? How can we be certain that we aren't going astray, in particular with all the paradoxes that were flying around in mathematics at the time? And the idea is, for logicists, we can be certain in mathematics by proceeding axiomatically, proof-theoretically, deriving mathematical truths from axioms that we can be certain about. Or at least that was the idea. Principia Mathematica that Russell wrote with A.M. Whitehead, 1910 to 1913. It's this enormous book that basically just chops axioms. It's a nightmare to read. No one really reads it anymore, but it was super, super important in the development of this area because of what it demonstrated. Really, for the first time, showing that logical tools, axiomatic tools, can be used to recapture, to prove large areas of mathematics, pretty much all of mathematics apart from very, very advanced set theory. And around this time, kind of because of this work he was doing on the foundations of mathematics and set theory, Russell discovered one of the things that he's really known for these days, Russell's paradox, a paradox in the foundations of mathematics. This is historically really important because it demonstrates a flaw in the way that Frege had tried to establish the foundations of mathematics. Now, Russell wasn't just out to try and knock other philosophers down, he tried to solve the problem on Frege's behalf. And in doing that, he came up with the theory of types. This is kind of like an alternative foundations of mathematics. In some ways, it's not used so much in mathematics anymore. Kind of mathematicians tend to use ZFC set theory in place of the theory of types. But Russell's theory of types got developed into what we now know as modern type theory, and that is a super important component of modern proof theory and modern theoretical computer science. So when I moved into a computer science department for my PhD, they were pretty scathing about philosophers, but I saw they were doing this thing called type theory. It was kind of central to all the work they did in theoretical computer science, and I was like, oh, that looks familiar. And yeah, it's a direct development of Russell's theory of types. Before we go any further, I'd just like to jump in here and say, I hope you're enjoying this content. If you'd like to help me out to make more educational academic content like this, go and take a look at my Ko-Fi page and see how you can help me out. Russell made contributions to metaphysics, particularly with the theory of logical atomism. So this is a really interesting development he made, I guess, through the 1910s and 20s when Wittgenstein was a student of his. They worked together, they discussed together, and they developed this theory of logical atomism. The idea that any fact in reality can be broken down into its component facts until we get these basic logical atoms, basic facts of reality out there independently of us in the world, which can't be broken down any further. And this has an interesting corollary for logic and philosophy of language, because according to Russell and Wittgenstein, these atomic facts, they kind of correspond to atomic propositions, things that we can think about and talk about, at least in theory, that combine in the ways of truth functional logic, the truth table method of logic. So there's this idea that language, or at least this ideal logical language, mirrors the structure of reality. The primitive propositions mirror the basic atomic facts of reality. And this is the basic idea in Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. When this came out during World War I, Wittgenstein was a prisoner in a prisoner of war camp, and Russell helped Wittgenstein get it published. And Russell wrote the introduction, and they'd worked on these ideas together. Wittgenstein seemed a bit pissed off with this, and he kind of claimed that Russell completely didn't understand Wittgenstein's thought at all. And, Wittgenstein and Russell would move apart after this. And, Wittgenstein, his thought would change a lot over the years, and he would really leave Russell behind. And okay, let's think about Russell's philosophy of language. One of Russell's key contributions to philosophy of language was his theory of descriptions. What I want to point out is that there is this key problem that he was addressing, problems about existence and non-existence that had troubled philosophers for decades, maybe for centuries, right? And his tools for addressing that weren't really metaphysical. They were to use the tools, the new tools of formal mathematical logic to analyze language and to show, yeah, actually, when we see the real form of the language, the problem kind of goes away. And that, his 1905 paper on denoting, kind of became a model of how to do analytic philosophy. It was very influential for Wittgenstein and for the logical positivists and for the ordinary language philosophers. Even though they didn't really acknowledge their debt to Russell, I think it's very much there. In epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and the philosophy of mind, Russell was also pretty influential. So he made this crucial distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. So acquaintance is the parts of the world that we have direct causal interaction with, and according to Russell, that really only extends to the contents of our own mind. Everything else we know by description. So that thinking led Russell to a theory of perception known as indirect realism. When we see a physical object in the world, what we are really seeing directly is an image or some kind of entity in our own mind. Our mind, our percepts, our sense data, they are the only things that we have direct acquaintance with. And so in some ways, we don't have direct acquaintance with the real physical world out there. We have to kind of reconstruct it logically from our perception, something that exists only in our mind. Now, he's not saying that nothing exists apart from our mind and the world is somehow made out of our mind. Rather, the world is out there independently of us, but we only have access to our own minds. So we have to reconstruct our knowledge of the world logically from our perceptions of it. Also, later on, he developed a theory of mind known as neutral monism. So monism is the idea that there aren't two kinds of substances out there, mind and physical matter. There's just one kind of substance. And then you might ask, okay, so which kind of has metaphysical priority? Is it the mind or is it matter? Now, one way of taking monism, and this is a very popular idea nowadays, is that the mind somehow arises or emerges from physical matter. But that's not how Russell took the idea. So the idea of neutral monism is that really mind and matter are in some ways the same substance. It's like two sides of the same coin. I find that a pretty difficult idea to get my head around, but it has had a bit of a resurgence recently. So lots of people have been getting interested in panpsychist ideas. That's the idea that in some sense, all of matter is in some sense conscious. And kind of neutral monism, it's not the same view, but there are some affinities between panpsychism and neutral monism. What about Russell's ethical and religious and political views? Well, here he didn't write much philosophy. He didn't write kind of academic philosophy on these things, but he did write and talk and debate an awful lot on these issues in the public realm. Russell believed, at least early on in his career, that moral facts are objective. Politically, he was as a liberal, a social democrat. Later on in his life, he supported a moderate version of socialism, but he didn't have much truck with Marxism or communism. He kind of described Marxism as metaphysically incoherent. He met Lenin and described what he saw as an impish cruelty in Lenin. Russell was an anti-imperialist. He was a pacifist, at least up until World War II. Throughout his life, he supported Zionism, the movement for an independent state of Israel, and he also supported Indian independence. He was the chair of the British India League. He was an atheist, or sometimes he described himself as an agnostic. So he said, as a philosopher, if I was speaking to a purely philosophic audience, I should say that I ought to describe myself as an agnostic, because I do not think that there is a conclusive argument by which one can prove that there is not a God. On the other hand, if I am to convey the right impression to the ordinary man in the street, I think that I ought to say that I am an atheist, because when I say that I cannot prove there is not a God, I ought to add equally that I cannot prove that there are not Homeric gods. Okay, I think that's a nice thought, right? So, strictly speaking, if you can't prove that the Christian God doesn't exist, you can't prove that the Olympic gods don't exist or that any other mythical figure doesn't exist. But pretty much nobody nowadays believe in the Olympic Homeric gods, right? Zeus and all that. So if you're an atheist with regard to them, Russell's saying, then he's also an atheist with regard to the Christian God, and any other God that you want to name. Okay, I want to finish up by talking a little bit about Russell's philosophical influence. In the middle part of the 20th century, from the 40s onwards, Russell really fell out of favour, at least in academic circles. He was also a popular public intellectual at this time, and I think a lot of academic professional philosophers kind of thought in that snooty way they had that he wasn't a real philosopher anymore, or that he'd given up doing serious philosophy just to do journalism and popular writing. But it was a little bit more than that. Russell and Wittgenstein had their split. Wittgenstein had a complete change of heart and a change of philosophical approach after writing his Tractatus. In Wittgenstein's second book, written in the 40s but published in the 50s, he describes a completely different way of doing philosophy, kind of focusing on the way language is used, that was completely at odds with his earlier philosophy and completely at odds with Russell's way of doing philosophy. Wittgenstein was massively influential, probably the most influential philosopher, at least in the analytic field, in the 20th century. So in Wittgenstein kind of, pushing back and talking down about Russell, I think those thoughts were kind of picked up in the general culture. But that said, a lot of Russell's ideas are really important to the way we think about philosophy nowadays. There's some specific ideas that we still talk about an awful lot, right? So there's Russell's theory of descriptions. That's still a leading contender in linguistics and philosophy of language when we talk about how definite descriptions work. There's Russell's theory of propositions, the units of thought or meaning or what a sentence expresses. That's still one of the leading theories of what propositions are. As I mentioned, Russell's theory of types developed into the modern theory of types, type theory, that we use kind of centrally in proof theory and in theoretical computer science. Russell's neutral monism, I think for a long time it was thought of as a pretty wacky idea, and personally I find it hard to get my head around it, but it's seen a revival in recent years, going along hand in hand with the revival of panpsychism. And I think on top of these ideas, Russell's writings are really important in introducing philosophy to new generations of people. In particular, his Problems of Philosophy, this little introductory book he wrote back in 1912. But I think for me, what makes Russell such an important historical philosophical figure is the kind of person he was. He was a super technical philosopher and mathematician and logician. He contributed real works of brilliance to those areas of philosophy. But he didn't just do that. He didn't just kind of do his technical stuff and say, I'm done. He contributed a huge range of ideas to the public, and he tried to speak to the public in non-technical ways. He tried to be understood and to reach out beyond the academy. That's not something that many technical philosophers, not many of the leading technical philosophers have tried to do. It's something more leading philosophers should have a go at. He emphasized clarity and precision in philosophy. And, that is super important, not just for philosophy, but for debate and interaction in general. I've always thought that if we could try to be more charitable and clearer when we're debating one another, the world will be a better place. And I think, unlike a lot of the leading philosophers of history, and in particular some 20th century philosophers, I've got Wittgenstein in mind, Russell was a very decent person. He was committed to social justice and to thinking about and talking about and writing about social justice throughout his life. And he didn't just think and write about it in an academic sense. He actually went out there and tried to make change. He tried to make the world a better place. He went to demos, he got arrested, he even spent time in jail based on his beliefs. And for me, Russell is a model of how to be a philosopher, how to be an academic. I really admire Russell for using the talents that he was born with to drive forward knowledge, to drive forward our understanding of the world, but also our ethical understanding, our understanding of what it is to be human, and to try and make the world a better place. There is so much more we could say about Russell, about his life and his thought. If you want to hear a bit more about the interaction between Russell and Wittgenstein, go and take a look at this video over here. If you've got any questions you want to ask me about this content, leave me a comment down below. Thank you to my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible. Thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back at Attic Philosophy soon.